All right, we're back with a new episode, and the world is, well, unfortunately not slightly, marginally less bad than it was between the last episodes. It's actually more than marginally worse, you know. A small portion of America is on fire, with more portions being forecasted to burn. There's an island in the Caribbean that is literally burning, throwing out plumes of smoke so big that it's blotted out the sun, and satellite images are actually amazing and breathtaking, but also horrifying. And I've got my good man Steve here. We have not got Craig, unfortunately. He was busy. So we're just going to drop in with something that's not bad news at all.
His real doll needs attention.
Probably. Could be. I don't even know. I have no idea what that is and disavow any knowledge of any such thing.
You don't know what a real doll is?
I'm going to say that sure, no. What is one of those?
It's the horrible mistake that you click on in Pornhub when all of a sudden you realize somebody's having sex with something that's not really alive and that nobody should be having sex with.
So it isn't something that would have anything to do with a comedian by the name of Peter Coffin.
I don't know. I don't know who that is. Pop culture references and I don't get along so well.
Oh, that's a deep, deep cut too. Well, suffice it to say that he had a either girlfriend or wife for a while that, she was very real, you know?
At least to him.
Well, I mean, the pictures were real, and she was probably real, you know, real brand.
Yeah. Nope, not a fan. You click on that, and then things aren't moving the way they're supposed to, and you're like, oh, something is horribly wrong. It's the uncanny valley. It exists. It exists at all levels of the human brain.
And you can have it for just a couple $grand.
Just a few.
I can think of better uses of my monies. I really can.
I mean, hookers are cheaper. I'm just saying.
Oh, I'm not even going to get into the story on that. But I will say that everybody who's interested should look up Real Doll Brothel. Don't do it on Google, because you don't want that in your search history. But it's a thing. And yes, the implication is exactly what you think it is. So, as you shudder and cringe at the thought of that, let's go ahead and drop into the show. We're going to talk about something interesting that happened that isn't actually as interesting as it sounds on the surface, but is nonetheless pretty cool. So, the Asdex upgrade experimental facility has generated plasma. Asdex? Is it?
I believe so.
They may have misspelled it. Wouldn't surprise me. So why don't you make some
you're right.
sense?
Asdex. I was thinking it was something else. Yep. My bad.
Yeah, no problem. So this is, I guess, the best way to really drop in quickly is to say that they've been one of the places that has actually been working on fusion power over the past decades, where a lot of other people have been kind of throwing a small amount of money in a money fire instead of actually researching anything. If I'm paraphrasing correctly.
Not quite. I mean, so the problem that you have with fusion that you don't have with fission, and to give folks an idea here, is with fission, it's actually pretty easy. If I have a neutral particle going into an atom, it's not really interacting with that outer shell of electrons. It's not really interacting with the positively charged nucleus core. So there's no real resistance. And what ends up happening with fusion is, while there's like 6 times more energy when we start fusing things, at least at the hydrogen level, than there is, per nuclide, so per unit mass essentially, there's 6 times more energy than there is for fission. We also have to overcome this huge energy boundary, which is the charged particles at the surface of the thing, which is the same reason why you don't fall through the floors and plummet horrendously towards the center of Earth and die in a fiery death. Right? That electron shell keeps those atoms apart. So we have to overcome that, and then on top of that, the positively charged nuclei need to interact with each other and bond and let the strong and weak nuclear forces take over, as opposed to the electromagnetic force, which is kind of repelling it at that point. So when we talk about fusion, we always talk about this high energy stuff, and this is all of the fusion facilities are trying to overcome this, and they're trying to overcome it with some form of confinement. Right, a star uses gravitational confinement. It's surrounded by a vacuum. Nothing has anywhere to go, and there's just a whole mass of it that keeps it all together. And so the energy released by fusion is balanced by the gravitational force on the outside, pushing back in. And that's how stars work. Well, trying to recreate the whole thing on Earth, we obviously don't have that much mass that we can throw at a reaction to confine all the particles together. So we're trying to do two different things. One is going to be essentially inertial confinement, and that's your laser types, where they basically fire a whole bunch of lasers at a hydrogen fuel pellet or some sort of fuel pellet, and they try to fire all of these lasers, which produce a ton of energy in the outward shell of these targets, and forces them together that overcomes that Coulomb barrier. And in the stuff that is in your more of your like donut shape reactor.
Let me stop you for a quick half second.
Sure.
I think I know what a Coulomb barrier is, and I'm going to say that at least half the listening audience is not at all. You mind giving us a quick TLDR?
So it's the same thing that I just talked about. The Coulomb barrier is the charged particle, or the charge repulsion effect from negatively charged particles like electrons repelling each other and positively charged particles like protons repelling each other.
Okay, so kind of the reason why electrons, neutrons, and all that kind of swim around in a self-repulsing sort of soup.
Well, it's the same reason, like I said, that you don't fall through the floor, right? What's actually occurring, your floor is not any more solid than anything else. I mean, it sort of is, obviously, but the reason you don't fall through your floor is the electrons in the outer shell of the atoms of the floor repel the outer shells of your foot. And so you're essentially being, what we don't see is we're essentially being pushed upwards at the same rate that we're being pushed downwards, because the electron to electron repulsion is significantly greater than the force of gravity. And that's why we can't go through solid objects. That Coulomb barrier is why we can't move through solid objects.
So in the grossest sense, kind of like the way that two magnetic poles repel each other.
Exactly. And in order to, where fusion occurs is when the nuclei themselves combine.
So,
right? And
so this, again, to put it very, very grossly, is that this would be like you're putting two very powerful magnets into contact with each other, or actually in this case, like pushing them together so much that they become one.
Essentially, yes.
Okay.
And that's kind of what the Coulomb barrier is. So you only have a couple ways to deal with that, and that is we have to confine these particles, forcing them to interact with each other with a significant amount of energy. So that's one of the reasons why when you start hearing. What's that?
Hence the laser pressure method you were talking about.
The laser pressure method is one of them. The other one is plasma confinement. So the laser fires on a target, but the Asdex, as well as a lot of the toroidal accelerators, they're attempting to do it with fusion plasma, right? So one of the reasons why cold fusion was desirable back in the day, before we kind of ruled that out as an illegitimate field, is it promised to do it at really low energies. Whereas whether you're using laser particles to bombard your target, which would be known as inertial confinement, or plasma physics, where you're just superheating these things up so they're zipping around super fast and slam into each other, breaking that Coulomb barrier, where basically everything gets heated up to that point. That is kind of your plasma confinement, where you're using electromagnetic fields to confine this stuff and superheat it. And the Asdex is in this latter category. So the Asdex facility has just recently gotten an upgrade to its diverter. And I think the thing that makes me laugh when you read this is they're like, oh, this has finally allowed it to operate closer to what it would look like in a real, operational facility. And you're like, okay, so why weren't they doing that to start? Like, what was the point in building something that wasn't something that you could use, only to later upgrade it to something that you could use? And this is one of the problems that you have with a lot of fusion stuff, is fundamentally these are the kind of issues you have. We're not throwing enough money at it. We're not investing heavily enough in these projects. And so the reason that fusion is always 20 years away is because we're never actually building the facilities that can generate fusion in the first place and then going, oh my God, look, fusion failed. I mean, the physics is very clear. Fusion will work, but we're also going to actually have to try to build it and get it operational and throw the money at it and do things like build operational style plants rather than theoretical physics reactors, which is what we've been doing.
So, what, basically they finally built one that will do the job?
Kind of. They so one of the problems that you have is that the best reactions are kind of your hydrogen isotopes, right? We've talked a little bit about deuterium. Deuterium is very, very desirable because the units that we typically deal with for nuclear reactions is MEVs, or mega electron volts. It's 1 million electron volts, and an electron volt is the energy gained by an electron, accelerated in a 1 volt field. So it actually has a direct correlation to joules and watts, and it's just very, very tiny. It's like 6.02 or 1.602 or something like that. I don't know the exact conversion off the top of my head, but times 10 to the minus 19th joules. So it's a very tiny unit of energy, but when you get a whole lot of atoms doing it all at once, it turns into a really, really large sum of energy. And we could even express chemical reactions in MEVs, but the amount you get per atom for chemical reactions is like 1/1 millionth of a nuclear reaction. So it's not particularly practical to do that. It's much more practical to do, hey, I've got 1 million of these atoms to get the same kind of results that we're seeing with hydrogen. But for deuterium, we get roughly, so the Coulomb barrier, going back to that, it requires 0.6 MeVs of energy per particle involved in the reaction to overcome that Coulomb barrier, right? In order to overcome it, 0.6 MeVs of energy have to be into the particle on top of whatever initiation stuff they have. Like that's the minimum energy requirement. If you do deuterium, you get 12 MeVs per particle out. If you do just a hydrogen, hydrogen will combine with another hydrogen, and it'll become a deuterium. It'll basically convert the proton into a neutron, but you only get 6 MeVs out of that reaction. So if we go with the deuterium, the reason that's a desirable reaction is that you get roughly 20 times more energy out of a fusion of 2 deuterium particles than you need to get them to actually initially fuse, whereas you only get 10 times as much energy out of normal standard hydrogens. And for reference, deuteriums, if you poured yourself an 8-ounce glass of water, there is enough deuterium in that, even though it's like 0.015% of all the hydrogen there is enough deuterium in that glass of water to power your house for 4 days. That's how much energy is available to us via fusion, just as a reference point. I know, it's kind of crazy. It really is. But when we start talking about these reactors, they've just kind of like, the diverter in this case, which is what they really upgraded, is, like I mentioned, you have this huge differential in energy output per unit reaction. We can actually react elements all the way up into, I think, oxygen or something like that. The one that we get nothing out of is iron. But I think it goes all the way up through oxygen and various, like we can add protons to it, we can do this kind of thing, but we get less and less energy per unit mass. So what we really want to do is we want to take some of these waste products that we're generating, some of the heliums and some of the other stuff, until we get better magnetic confinement, so that we can keep it at these really high energy yield reactions from the hydrogens and the deuteriums and the tritiums. That is why they're putting this thing in. It's not completely useless. The funny part is that they had this. They already had a diverter, but they're actually upgrading it to one that would work in a more like power plant type operational way. And you're kind of like, well, why didn't you do that in the first place? They didn't it wasn't a broken machine, but it's one of those things where,
so they've been running on something like a prototype this whole time?
Pretty much, yeah. Or more like, imagine for a moment that you needed to get to work, so you built yourself a car, and it was a fantastic car. You got the shell of a Beamer, and then you sat there and put a golf cart engine in that Beamer, right? Yeah, it'll go, but that's not to say that it'll go very well or very fast or much like the namesake vehicle, and they're basically getting an actual Beamer engine to put inside that vehicle.
In this case, one of the 4 cylinders as opposed to one of the V8s, though, right?
I mean, probably. Material science has come a long way. So realistically, the diverter is probably. Using it as an engine is probably an inaccurate thing. It's probably more like having a little mini muffler for a golf cart versus an actual properly sized thing. There's better investments being made in the electromagnetic materials that are surrounding these toroidal shapes than there is in a lot of the other stuff. And the toroidal shapes, by the way, if you want a good visual exercise in what these laser systems would look like, that's not what I'm talking about when I talk about the toroids. But watch the Expanse. The Expanse actually at some point in I think season 2 or 3. That's how their fusion drive engines are projected to work, and they actually show the fuel pellets being bombarded by a laser, and then it all of a sudden not working. So it's right when they kind of get into the ring. But the toroids are really what a lot of people kind of see more for fusion. The biggest problem with the toroids is, again, that you have to superheat every single atom up to that 0.6 MeV of energy. And it's actually quite a bit. So to give you an idea, room temperature, most particles are traveling around with about 0.025 eV. So to get up to, 0.6 MeV, right, we're talking about accelerating these particles by 40 times roughly 600,000. So 2.4 million-ish degrees kind of thing, or 2.4 million times the kinetic energy of room temperature particles, which is a lot. And that requires a tremendous amount of energy investment to get there. Once they generate the plasma, they have to basically keep it running, and then they have to try to feed fuel in at the same time that it's running. And they've got calculations that support the ability to do this. The problem is that, we've had to build them on bigger and bigger scales, whereas now we're starting to move into the material science phase of things, which is going to be better electromagnets, which means smaller reactors, which means less energy to get to plasma and more energy out from that plasma. So, and in this case, this is just adding a piece of equipment that helps keep that reaction running precisely rather than having impurities, which kind of impair that ability. And it would be the kind of thing that, imagine that we had really crappy gasoline rather than the stuff that we do now, where you just kind of, you went into your average grocery store and grabbed a random bottle of vegetable oil, right? Different vegetable oils are going to have different purities, and if you happen to grab a bad batch of vegetable oil, your engine's not going to run all that well. It's the same kind of thing with fusion.
Okay, fair enough. Yeah, as I'm reading in this too, the article, it kind of makes that clear. Says they've got a conversion plan for mid-2022, which is intended to prepare the plant for the future, and the goal of their research is to develop a power plant. With the talk of finally building, what is this? Therefore, be used to develop operating modes for a potential power plant. So,
right, and that's kind of the thing is they've got theoretical exercises, but
yeah,
again,
really,
if you want to turn on your,
why not just go ahead? We do understand how it's going to work well enough to know that it's not going to turn into some black hole or some self-feeding.
Well, every single time you turn it on, you have to heat that plasma, that entire chamber, which is largely the size of a small warehouse. You have to heat that up to millions of degrees, or at least tens of thousands of degrees. I think it's millions, though. If you're having heat that much, if you have to put that much energy in, it's not cheap to flip the switch on that, right? Like each trial run is very, very expensive because the amount of energy required is quite a bit. And because they haven't quite managed to break the energy threshold, they're not actually generating any energy off of that, which means it's literally just a money sink each time they do it. Now they're getting pretty close. I think they're at like 0.99 or something like that % of energy in versus energy out.
So if I'm not mistaken, that would be that they have not yet broken Unity?
I do not believe they have broken Unity yet. Now, granted, one of the problems that you have is there's a lot of other stuff that's technically happening in the background, right, outside of these research reactors. So I believe Lockheed Martin back in 2014 announced that they had made some major breakthrough in fusion, and their Skunk Works, which is kind of their rapid prototyping design team, was hoping to have a fusion reactor prototype built by like 2020, 2021. And they were going to hope to hit mainstream commercial production by 2025, 2026. So I don't know whether that's real because I haven't heard anything else about it. But when we start talking, and then you have other things like the Stellarator. The Stellarator used a unique, rather than just using a standard kind of toroid shape, they used unique shapes to try to generate those plasmas on a much smaller scale. There's a guy out in MIT land over there in Boston who's got something that's like a garage-sized thing that he did with new electromagnets. So my understanding is that we haven't really achieved unity, but we're really, really close to unity.
Okay.
Like, we're really, really close, and I think the kicker is that had we spent the money 60 years ago, when we kind of, like, figured out fission for the most part, and just had, like, minor, well, I don't want to say minor, but, process improvements to go, had we spent the money on fusion, we could have had this technology 30, 40 years ago, and had none of the problems that we have today. I mean, what would we complain about?
Oh, I'm sure that there are plenty of things our overlords and oligarchs could find for us to quabble over.
Oh, I'm sure.
Because that's what they're going to do. I mean, like, did you get your Trump vax yet? Did you go out and get your Trump jab?
Never.
Did you go out and participate in our Operation Warp Speed? I was getting some shit about that today on Twitter.
Really?
Yeah, they're, what was my exact word? I said, you don't trust the vaccines Trump helped put into place? And,
He's trying to cause some shit.
I was. To one Joe Walsh, an ironic, still a follower of mine. Somehow, he initially said that he would take up his musket for Donald Trump. He has, since that time, turned into a neocon rhino that doesn't really want to conserve much of anything, and he seems to like Joe Biden for some reason. So, I guess, more power to you. He follows me through all this nonsense, and I kind of prod at him with these questions every once in a while.
Well, I mean, I think that we do need to, like, we talked a little bit in the pre-show about how Trump kind of screwed himself. But I think we do need to appreciate for a moment the power of the media and social media to literally alter the narrative and then take, like, the primary solution America has to get out of this thing and not give Trump any credit whatsoever for any of it.
Yeah, it's pretty astounding. And I mean,
it is like, when you look at it, it's pretty stunning that they basically turned around and said he was botching the entire thing, only to have it be that the day after the election, all of a sudden all these companies were releasing the fact that their vaccine was ready to go.
Yeah, that was conveniently timed.
Was indeed.
It's just a coincidence, I'm sure.
I'm sure it was.
They probably slept in. You know, you do that sometimes. You're real tired after working on a vaccine to save people and everything. But hey, what do I know? I'm not some biologician, so it would be outside of my field of expertise. All I know is that we've been lied to, all our lives. So just remember, I might even be lying to you now. I'm not, but, just kind of approach the world that way. I'd also rather tell you good people's the truth. And you too. Because it's just easier telling the truth. Lies are significantly more complicated in the world. So, no. I'll save the good lies for later. We'll drop into something else a little bit less dark and dreary. Wasn't there? Oh yeah, we'll pass on that one because that's super dark and dreary for the moment. But we do have something fun and interesting. If you'll scroll back up to just a couple days ago, I linked something from who was this? Fizzorg about the current climate model simulations overestimating the sea level rise.
Yes.
This is good stuff. This will bring a smile to your heart and a little bit of joy to your day. I'll make sure. And of course, this will all be linked down below or to the side or above or wherever the hell it is on whatever service you're watching and or listening to this. But the long and short is you were lied to. So let's hop into that.
Yeah. So I mean, Evan, I'm gonna say that at some point we should set up like an actual organized show rather than just riffing on this stuff. Or Craig and I go in and put forth some of our better arguments against climatology, or kind of really walk through.
I really want to get somebody that actually supports, traditional ideas of climate change to just come on and discuss the whole thing with all of us.
I think that would be a valuable thing.
I haven't had a lot of luck. But, hey, if anyone that's listening knows anyone that might be interested in the conversation, I'll be happy to have it.
But, I mean, if you want to start talking about, like, the central theme of me and my kind of, like, issue with a lot of these sciences, I'm a STEM guy.
Well, it's bad science, right?
Right? Well, yeah. And that's really the core of it. Is you have
it's sloppy, ugly science. It's not even like pretty bad science. It's garbage.
Well, it's kind of tough to sit there and talk about it that way. The issue that you have is that climatology it basically hops press release to press release to press release. So what ends up happening is everybody who wants to root on renewable energy or whatever other disastrous idea the progressives have for the planet will sit there and wait for this crazy, crazy result. And it'll say something like, we're all going to die. Now, granted, there's some caveats to this, which I've talked about before. They don't use numbers in climate change, in climate science. Anytime you want to talk about climate change, there's no numbers involved. They don't tell you how much it's going to cost for their solution. They don't tell you how much it's going to cost for climate change. They don't give you a period of time over which these changes are purportedly going to occur. They won't even sit there and isolate the exact value upon which the change was supposed to be. And so what you get is you have this completely like information devoid argument talking about the disasters of climate change while simultaneously ignoring any actual solutions or sitting there and proposing solutions to problems which we haven't evaluated for the simple cost benefit of, are we spending more to solve this than it's actually worth? Now, the biggest disaster that purportedly comes out of climate change is always sea level rise. That's always what they go back to because the cities will get drowned. Now, realistically, if you go back through the literature, the traditional mainstream view for climate has been that the expected sea level rise over the next 100 years is only about 1 foot to 3 feet at the very most. Which, again, absolutely huge fucking range, right? Plus or minus 150% should be considered unacceptable tolerances.
Wow. Is that big?
For policy. Well, yeah.
That's a little.
Or sorry, plus or minus 100%. It's. I mean, if you took the midstream view of 2 feet, right? And that was the mainstream. The low end is 1 foot, and the high end is 3 feet. Now, granted, you start talking about, hey, which scenarios are most plausible? The 3 feet pretty much gets ruled out almost immediately, and the more probable value is going to be in the 1 to 2 feet range, assuming everything is true. But what this study came and found is that those estimates are roughly 25% too high, which is a lot. Like, 100%, plus or minus 100% is unacceptable. Plus or minus 25% is also unacceptable. And this is the problem that you have with folks like myself, who are numbers guys, who we have to make these kinds of decisions that actually reflect, public interest and spending and the value of the dollar.
Money and lives.
Right? Money and lives, right? We have to make these decisions. And when they're sitting there and they're coming out and they're saying, hey, guess what? It could be between 1 and 3 feet. Okay. Well, first off, 3 feet's really not that bad over 100 years, right? You get probably 5 full infrastructure rebuilds of anything around the coastline over that period of time. So even if you were to talk about 3 feet, that's going to be covered with less than a foot of change. That's probably going to be less than a foot of change between any two of those things. So 3 feet is really something that we can very easily adapt to. 1 foot is something that is even more easily to adapt to. So you can actually see us and see some of the machines that we've built to lay bricks. And we can basically put a layer of bricks down. We can put thousands of bricks down and entire sidewalks and stuff like that around our parks and our nation's waterways and seawalls very, very quickly. And we certainly have enough time to do that over the next 100 years. It's not an insurmountable problem. But
that's a fair point.
When all of a sudden you find out that the actual range is 25% less than that, so it's between 3/4 of a foot or 8 inches and 2.5 feet. That's a very bad place to be. Like I'm not super okay with.
That's
again,
a pretty large amount of variance.
It would still be a large amount of variance, and I'm not sure what their exact value is, but they're probably just chopping it. Most of the time when they do these kinds of they present their value that they get to get all their publication and press off of and get it to, rally everybody together for the progressive cause. They usually walk back only the top end numbers, and they walk them back quite a bit. And it's usually six months to a year or two later. And then all of a sudden they'll publish a paper saying, oh yeah, well by the way, it really wasn't that bad. And it only gets picked up by the skeptics and the non-politicized community because, well, newspapers need to sell you something, and fear is an easy monetary gain for them. Whereas, everything's going to be okay is not.
It's really a shame because there's so much interesting shit that's legitimately happening. Materials science has actually interesting stories new every week because so much is happening in the field. Just materials science. Things with graphene, things with superconductors, room temperature superconductors. We're almost there. I think we might be there, at least in the laboratory. I mean, the world might be on fire, but not all of it. I mean, for fuck's sake, people.
Well, and this is kind of the real issue is, oh man. This is kind of the real issue is that they basically, they sell a much larger problem than really exists. And more importantly, baked into these assumptions is this, we're never going to have, we have the technology to solve these problems today, right? We have the technology to do that. We have the technology 60 years ago. We know the path forward on energy. We know the path forward on infrastructure. And realistically, we haven't even begun to approach the debate of even if we could stop climate change from happening, right? Assuming that we could, right? Is it a better investment to sit there and, suspend fossil fuel burning and suspend heating your house and all these other stuff and basically, kick us back to an agrarian lifestyle, as opposed to building the natural barriers around these places that are still going to get hit by natural disasters regardless of whether climate change occurs or doesn't occur. Whether it's better to sit there and actually eliminate the threat with some amount of money or invest in all of this other stuff that might possibly subdue some of the effects. And that's a terrible thing. Like, you take a look at the Houston floods that was, a few years ago, right?
Yeah.
2017, 2018, somewhere in there.
Yeah, we're not talking about the Houston freeze. We're talking about the flood, so yeah.
The floods, yeah. So
because the freeze could have been stopped. The flood, well, that's a little less able to be planned for.
That was a unique case of a massive hurricane happening right after a massive rainstorm, where basically the delta had a whole bunch of water that needed to be tossed off into the sea, and the storm surge was coming in, so basically the water had nowhere to go. And after this, one of the proposals that they talked about doing was building something called the Spine of the World. And it sounds pretty badass name.
Yeah,
I have to say to myself. Like, Texans really know how to name things. Texans are at least as good about naming as the left is about most of their movements. But the Spine of the World was essentially a seawall, sort of, but not really a seawall. More of kind of like a structure that would connect a lot of these little chain islands along the bay and build them up so that it was going to be a certain distance above the sea. And then when major hurricanes or major storms came, they could actually either basically it would be open to ships and whatnot. But during a major storm, it would close up, seal up, and they would basically pump out the bay so that when a hurricane came, the structure would have the ability of actually keeping floodwaters completely at bay, making the threat of a future storm go away entirely. And all that expensive. $50 billion is expensive, and I think that was the proposal. But imagine eliminating all future storm damage to the city of Houston. That is the price that we're talking about paying versus, trillions of dollars in climate. $50 billion is nothing in comparison to Joe Biden's $5 trillion climate plan, right? It's paltry, and it would protect the city and all of its residents. Right, and we could embark in some major infrastructure projects like that in many places, which would utterly eliminate the threats associated with, climate. And if climate is as much of a natural phenomenon as the skeptics believe, or it's all entirely caused by humankind, we wouldn't have to make these trade-offs between suffering and extreme poverty because we gave up fossil fuels and decided not to pursue nuclear energy because we're idiots, or sitting there and investing in renewables, which don't work. We could have this third option, which is infrastructure build-outs that would utterly eliminate these engineering and infrastructure build-outs that would eliminate these problems to begin with. And these are things that we can do with our current technology. They aren't things that are crazy far off. And it really is kind of detrimental that they would much rather talk about how we have impending doom from rising sea levels by using exaggerated numbers that they have to walk back 6 months to a year later.
Yeah, we do see that quite a lot these days, especially as the science keeps expanding and Freedom of Information Acts keep getting filed. That a lot of the numbers just aren't good. I mean, they're legitimately bad numbers. And bad numbers makes for bad science, and bad science makes for uninformed decisions.
Yep.
And stupid knee-jerk reactions to orange men that you hate. But anyway.
Well, I mean, I think part of Trump's problem was also that he was an executive manager, and so he didn't really need to know about things. He paid people to know about things for him, and a lot of people don't really understand that.
Yeah.
You don't have to be the smartest guy in the room. You just have to hire the smartest guy in the room, and you have to know how to handle all of that stuff. So they'd start asking Trump questions, and he'd be like, I don't know.
Like, I'm not the science guy. I pay the science guy to come up with the answers to these questions.
Yep.
Unfortunately, he paid the wrong science guy to, in the form of Fauci. Maybe he should have just said, Fauci, maybe stick to what you know. Hang out in some brothels or some, bathhouses and, figure out what you can figure out about COVID from there. That's where you're needed. That's your field. That's your passion. You do that, and we'll get somebody that knows a little bit better about this to talk about it.
Well, I mean, I think the biggest problem is that he hired a lot of people who had a lot of decent credentials but weren't willing to stand up to the media. And
Absolutely.
the first few years Trump stood up to the media, and in the last few years he didn't. And the difference between and that's partially because every single time he said something negative about the press or he said something negative about whatever was going on, they would come after him and lambaste him, and that was the whole 3-year, oh my dear God, he's secretly a Russian asset kind of thing. I think that he kind of wussed out towards the end there.
He absolutely did. He absolutely did. If he'd have been, he didn't even need to be like a strongman dictator. He just needed to use the powers that were available to him. But he, for some reason, decided not to. I want to say that Jared Kushner probably had a hand in that decision because we know he's had a hand in some of his other terrible decisions. So maybe so.
Yeah.
He seems to be really good at screwing things up for the man. And, well, who knows? Who knows? Maybe he's good for something. Maybe we'll see. I hope it doesn't have to do with him having anything to do with politics in 2024, because I'll be as far away from voting for that man as I probably can be. But on the note of people not to vote for, I've got another one that I did drop. I hope you got a chance to look over this, but I mean, it's really something that everybody pretty much should already know. I think I just put it into the chat. But basically, long and short is sociopaths and psychopaths gonna sociopath and psychopath.
Ah, yes.
And the article, long and short, people with the dark triad of personality traits are known to use victimhood to gain advantage over others, as the article states, and as we all know, because that's pretty much exactly what it is. If you've ever had to deal with an abusive person, you've dealt with it directly. They don't, even when they do feel things, it kind of doesn't matter to them, because they have a goal. Now, this is obviously not the case in all people. I'm speaking more in the terms of a sociopath. A psychopath, a real psychopath doesn't feel the things, and so they just have goals and achieve them, and you can only hope that they've been raised well. A sociopath, there's maybe not hope for them. Depends on how they've their own inclinations.
So this is actually an interesting thing.
Oh, it absolutely is. Oh, the dark triad, by the way: narcissism, psychopathy, and Machiavellianism. And by the way, the prince was not an instruction manual. It was meant to talk shit about a prince.
It was sort of meant to be a guide. At least
a guide to identifying shitty people. But yes.
It wasn't when the guy, I can't remember the guy's name, when he wrote it, it wasn't that he was attempting to guide somebody who he felt was completely incompetent, to give him some suggestions in how he better rule because he's probably an idiot. And the background story was, this was in Italy way back, I think it was Italy, right?
Yeah, Machiavelli.
Machiavelli, yeah, of course it was Machiavelli. And so the prince, basically, the king had died, and Machiavelli really loved the king. And so the prince came to power as like a 15-year-old kid. And he'd kind of been into drunken debauchery before. So Machiavelli had zero hope that he would be a good king. And basically the arguments laid out in The Prince were essentially, well, if you can't be a good king, you might as well be a really shitty person. Because then at least you won't lose your kingdom.
Yeah, I mean, that's roughly accurate. Bravo, you really summed that up pretty nicely.
That's kind of the premise. So when we start talking about the dark triad traits, and I know that Craig is a big fan of them, basically there's a whole bunch of like personality disorders, and I'll be honest, you know these people when you meet them, right? Like you find
out quickly enough. They reveal themselves by their nature.
They do. So if you are somewhat cognitively aware, right? I've only sat down with people who are truly, like I actually have a family member who I would say has a lot of these traits, and they kind of unnerve me and skeeve me out, but they're semi-harmless because they're ineffectual. That being said, I have also sat down with these people, and when you deal with people who are truly in the psychopathy domain, like the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. The true sociopaths, the true psychopaths, they creep you out. There's a lot of people who will be, you might hear people call somebody a sociopath. A lot of times most people aren't. They're not very common in society. In prison, the estimated amount is roughly 10% of the population. In the general population, it's 1%. So 1 out of every 100 people you meet entirely at random is going to fall into this category. And if you have any sense, you will know exactly what's going on. Because you feel like you're dealing with a predator. Like, there's a hungry lion at that table and he wants to eat you. And it's nothing that they will specifically do because they have to kind of mask themselves, but they're very scary individuals and you just feel very unnerved. I've only met a handful of them, and you know who they are. When you start talking about these traits, this study actually backs up a lot of other stuff that has done analysis on the left versus the right. And a lot of these studies come out, so I have a lot more faith in something that highlights negative traits on the left than the right, simply because psychology has 96% of them are liberal. So anything that is favorable to liberals is going to generally get by, whereas anything that's favorable to conservatives undergoes a lot more scrutiny. It's not strictly speaking confirmation bias.
Well, I mean, if we look at Sokol Squared, we can see that pretty clearly.
Right. So when we start talking about what are we looking at when we start looking at these negative traits, what we know is from a young age, children are largely sociopaths, like young kids. You see these cute little TikToks and YouTube videos and Facebook videos. That child knows he's getting a toy because he's making mommy's heart warm, and that is the entire reason that he's doing the cute thing instead of murdering his sibling. So children are largely sociopaths. They just happen to be largely confined in the household, but that's why you have the terrible twos and the no phase and a lot of these other things parents have. They are literally dealing with a sociopath and trying to train them to not be a sociopath. That's not to say it does. After you get through your kind of classical conditioning phase, you enter a period where you have most kids go through a phase if they play a game, right? Where when they're really young and they get to the game is played out like this. There's cookies, candies, money, whatever it is, some sort of choice treat that's associated that is particularly desirable to that age group. And they will have a game where you and a group of others are playing this game together, and then one individual within the group gets to assign how the rewards are done, right? They basically get a metric of who played what, who did what, and then they get to assign the rewards. At the very youngest of ages, and this is where the children are sociopaths thing comes in, the child who is assigned the choice of divvying up the rewards will always choose himself, right? If there are no consequences to not giving the candy to the other kids, he'll take all the candy, or she'll take all the candy. And that's what happens at the youngest phase. By the time you hit like your elementary school age kid, they have been socialized usually to the point, and had successful interactions, and they actually move. I think it's probably elementary school. They move into a new model, which is sharing. Right? It doesn't matter who did what amount of work. Everybody gets the same reward. Right? Everybody gets 2 pieces of candy kind of thing. And then when you start moving into the teenager or adolescent phase of development, they start moving more towards divvying up rewards based on the amount of work contributed, regardless of whether they are the hardest working individual or they are not the hardest working individual. That's how they will perceive the rewards to be. What has been noticed is that liberals have a tendency to stay stuck at that phase where all they do is share the rewards. They don't progress beyond it. And you run into this is great for an empath, a caregiver or something like that. It's not so great for practical applications of dealing with things. And that means that there is a group of people who exist, who all you have to do is convince them that the world is unfair, and they will shower you with money. And that's what this study is essentially going into, is it's saying, hey, there's a group of people who was identified that if they claim to be a victim, regardless of the truth of it, people will provide them resources.
Now, if it happens to ring a familiar bell in your head, that's purely a coincidence. Pure coincidence. Surely these people aren't badly damaged individuals at all. Continuing, sorry, just had that thought.
Well, there's a little bit more to it than that, right? So there's other studies that have come out more recently that have been studying things like virtue signaling. And so we've always, like, the old tale used to be the Republican who would go out there and be anti-gay, and he would, vocally talk about how not gay, how much he hated gay people. And then he would basically be sitting there trying to pick up whatever man came into the stall next to him. Or, the pedophile who sits there and lives a life where he is a very pious individual and, doesn't do that. They signal their virtue. More recently, this has moved into new territories, specifically with the left, and this will be things like the annoying vegans. I know vegans that are very nice people. I know a vegan who's a very nice person. I'm going to limit it to one because I only know one. But then the rest of them are the really irritating people who show up on social media doing the, hand clappy thing about how great it is to be a vegan and how terrible you are for eating meat. And this also goes into things like, you're a racist. I'm anti-racist. Those kinds of people all are virtue signaling how good they are at whatever it is, and the whole reason that they do it is because they get resources for it. And this is not a surprise. And they've actually identified this in previous papers. One of the most recent ones was that these dark triad traits, I don't think it was dark triad exactly, but it was sociopathy in particular, could actually be codified along political alignment. So on top of having more empaths on the left, there are more people who prey upon the empaths on the left because it found that sociopathy is much more common on the left and can actually be identified with political testing. Now, the key thing here is that was a very interesting study, and I've actually talked about it previously, not because it in and of itself was particularly interesting, but when they originally reported the results, they reported it that conservatives were more likely to be sociopaths, except for the fact that they had characterized a -1 as a 1, and -1 typing was for conservatives, and +1 typing was for liberals, so they were actually wrong and had to publish an edit to their paper. I'm not sure why it didn't get retracted, but the edit to the paper was that political testing did identify it, but it was actually the liberals who were more likely to be sociopaths.
Sorry, we got that completely backwards, actually.
Yep.
But, no retractions. It just, we'll put it on, page 987, small print at the bottom in the document.
Which, again, goes to why it is that I trust publications that come out of psychology that are less beneficial to progressive causes than those that are not, because they do things like that, and you do see that routinely.
Okay,
but this is actually pretty
normal. Like we want to use CNN as a source. I know they're garbage. Right. I mean, if they're saying it, then wow.
I mean, so what this really points out is that if you don't want to be a sucker, don't listen to victimhood narratives. That's the best thing that you should take away from this. The second thing that you should take away is the reason that the left has become completely enamored in social justice and wokeness and critical race theory and a lot of these other kind of nonsense concepts is because a lot of them are really good people, right? They may have stopped, their personal.
I've actually said this in private conversations, that a lot of the people that have done a lot of the worst things in recent years aren't intrinsically bad. They've just been lied to.
Right, and that's kind of what's ended up happening, is the left has always been the bleeding hearts, and that's very good. Like, we need empaths in our society. I was hanging out with a gay dude who was a fantastically humorous gay dude, very much an empath. He basically goes and holds the hands of the dying in elderly care facilities, right? Like, we need people like that because I couldn't handle it, right? But at the same time, we also don't need those. It's probably not the best choice to have those people making decisions because at the end of the day, you know, you're going to be forced to choose between the puppy dying. You have $100 that can either save a puppy or save a kitten, right? And this is a choice that you're going to face every single day, and the empath will choose to save the puppy and then borrow $100 to go save the kitten. And over time, they basically bury themselves in a giant hole because they've tried to do the right thing too many times. And it shouldn't be a surprise then if they are so intrinsically wired to give up their money to good causes that there is a group of people who have identified that and are actively seeking to attract some of those resources, because it's easier to sit there and basically, prey on this vulnerable group of people than it is to, go out and learn a real skill, like engineering.
Now, that being said, I do want to make a very specific point on this topic. Anyone that tries to frame any of these arguments in, well, not any. Anyone who tries to frame any of these, how shall I describe them? The voter security acts that are going in place across the nation. The Georgia one in specific is literally the perfect example because it is a compromise. It provides expanded hours, expanded access. It provides a state-issued ID in the case that you need one, and it makes it even easier for you to vote even if you don't. I mean, you need as little as any paper bill and the last four of your social. I mean, you really can't quite get much easier than that. So anyone who wants to frame this in any other fashion than that they are supremely racist is either very stupid, very smart, or very racist, and also probably very smart. Because I find in a lot of my interactions with these people, they're kind of closeted racist, and they get very upset when you confront them with it. Because the long and short of the argument is, you're saying that a black guy, black girl, a black zer, for that matter, can't even figure out how to get an ID, that they're such a lowly animal, such a pathetic creature that they can't even do such a basic thing. Now, this is completely going outside of the comedy bits that we've seen where somebody would go around and ask a bunch of black people in, say, New York City the question, hey, do you have an ID? Because the answer is always yes, because we live in a modern society, and every single person that is functional in the world of today knows at least how to get one, even if they don't have one. So the idea that these can be framed in any other way is kind of disingenuous. And to see people frame it as racism is pretty much purely just either racism or self-hating racism, in the case of Will Smith just today. The Fresh Prince, being a little prince in his own right, he came out and said that he thinks that it's terrible that Georgia is making it easier for black people to vote. Those weren't his exact words, but those are what his exact words said. So take it as you will, but that's the way that I recommend anyone frame these arguments, because it's not even a stretch. It's just telling the truth in a slightly different way.
Yep. That's kind of the problem.
So having said that, familiarize yourself with Alinsky. Rules for Radicals is a great toolbook that you have to be willing to put down when the tools are no longer useful, because they are ugly tools and they are uncomfortable to the hand, shall we say, and shouldn't really be used, but they are very good.
This is the problem with activists, right? I've talked about this before. I hate activists because activists don't know when to quit. And they're trying to do the right thing, but the problem is that they eventually run out of, right things to do.
Well, it's been said more than once before, on a long enough timeline, you will see yourself as the villain. So, So with that, I personally just always try and maintain a really bare, low-level kind of villainy, so that you can never be too much of a good guy. So you never really, even if you fall, you don't fall that far. So it all works out that way, right? That's good math, isn't it?
Yep.
Oh, so there we go. See. So it's not, unfortunately, like some awesome segue, but I had every intention of talking about this, so I'm going to. So it seems that Joe Biden has decided on a new head for the alcohol, firearms, and tobacco industry. The alcohol, alcohol, firearms, and tobacco. It's not ATF, it's AFT. That they're going to be getting a new head. This guy, he's got a long history of service. I'm not sure if he was at Ruby Ridge, but he has been seen in photos in Waco. As a matter of fact, he was posing in front of a compound, actually, in Waco in the 90s, showing off some of his trophies, we'll say. In this case, the trophies would be the charred corpses of children that he burned alive. But, there you are. So this is the man that has been chosen to lead one of the worst and least effective governmental agencies that has possibly ever existed. And, well, I just urge everyone to do their due diligence. But he's been a prominent voice against human rights, at least in the United States, since the middle 90s. So, of course, he'll be, heading up an organization that polices people's human and property rights. Smart, eh?
It's always amazing how these people always come back. It's like a bad...
Like a revolving door.
Yeah.
Of garbage and sewage and evil.
Yep.
And boy, I don't know. I actually don't really have any other particularly interesting topics I was wanting to riff on this week. If there's anything else you're wanting to talk about. Otherwise, I'm kind of happy to make this one a short one.
You know what? That's fine with me. I mean, everything else was... I think we covered most everything else that was really interesting. Yeah. I mean, there is the effectively low, or the Chinese vaccine
actually, yeah, we do need to go over that because that's going to... it's always good to end on a high note. Let me get a link to that for everybody because, well, I mean, it's actually not. It's kind of sad. But, schadenfreude being what it is, we might as well have a laugh at the Chinese for the China virus, right?
Yep.
All right, let me bring that up here. And there's another one. I'd like to have Craig along for this one to talk about it, but the Pentagon's got a new microchip coming out that, mark of the beast, who knows. But we'll get into that later. But the Chinese vaccines, the multiples, actually, they're not showing anywhere near the level of effectiveness of the biotech Pfizer one or the Moderna vaccine. I don't know if even they are reaching the levels of the Janssen vaccine, for that matter. But let me get the link for all of you good folks. Have you got that handy?
Which one? The China facts stuff?
Yeah.
That should be, if you just go to show ideas.
Oh, yeah, I was asking if you had it
right there.
Yeah, well, basically,
sorry.
Yeah, they're basically saying that they don't have very high protection rates. As I look through this, it seems like they might be kind of desperate to get a hold of ours, which would explain some of the intelligence faux pas that have happened in the very recent past involving doctors trying to get trying to get the data on various ones. Actually, I know the French firm had some issues with one of their doctors going rogue. I know there have been at least two high-placed PhDs, I believe, that have been arrested for doing the same thing here in the States, and I believe that's happened at least in Russia as well.
Yeah, I mean, so what I see here is I see...
Yeah, they have 5 vaccines at this time, and the best one they've got is 79%, which is
So they got one that's technically 83.
Oh, I see.
But each of them, so the problem that they have is that the efficacy is between 50 and 83%, right? And that's because their trials are not particularly well done.
I can believe
so
that.
What ends up happening is they can't quite say whether or not it's really as effective as they say it is because they have sampling issues. So, for instance, what is it? Oh, I thought it was something about grabbing a whole bunch of old people.
No, they put all those in the furnaces already.
Every place that they've tried it, it's not doing so well. And this is by the way, again, depending on their sampling data and everything else, all of that stuff is one of the reasons why I'm very skeptical of the safety overall. That's why I'm holding out. I'm not saying that you should, but in this case, what the surprising part of the story is not just that that China is attempting to sit there and steal our vaccine stuff, because pretty much China tries to steal everything that they can, but that they're publicly admitting that their vaccines don't work.
Yeah,
that's stunning.
Yeah, to really put a bow on this, or I guess in this case to put a cherry on top, is this comes out of Xinhua, and Xinhua is absolutely loath to release anything that is in any way even dismissive of Chinese prowess. So to see something like this come out is a real blow.
Yep.
So as it stands, just to give some base numbers out, just to quote the article, they say 50 to over 79, which that'd be about the 83% effectiveness, whereas the Pfizer and Moderna are at about 95%, and I believe the Johnson & Johnson vaccine is at something like 75%, but I believe, aside from the recent issues that have come up, which, to my understanding, the recent issues with the Johnson & Johnson vaccine rollout have been environmental factors, where the people have been probably too hot when they got the vaccine, and that caused, I believe, some lightheadedness and some fainting issues.
Yep.
I'll get back on that once I've got some more issues, because that's the only one I would personally endorse, just as a by the by. If you're going to get the vaccine, get the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, and if you're also going to do that, try and actually keep yourself in as good a shape as you can, because that's going to do your body better in learning to fight this thing once it's got it in its system as well. So, don't let your guard down. Go ahead and take off the mask after you've had it in your system. For I believe the mean time to maximum antibodies is something like 28 days, and I think I don't know how long this one will last, because it's a little bit newer, but they say the mean time on the Pfizer and Moderna is about maybe about 18 months, and they say that the mean time on immunity for actually just acquiring the thing is about 18 months, possibly 2 years. But, I mean, we're not years out, so we're just going to have to play it by ear and see. Honestly, considering the fact that the Johnson & Johnson is built off of, an actual coronavirus and is a largely traditional vaccine, I see it as a safer option. You're not going with something that, as much shit as Craig would give me for saying it's a gene therapy, it's kind of a gene therapy.
Well, I don't know. It is borderline gene therapy. I mean, know that it's
in
purely
technical terms, it kind of is.
Right.
It kind of isn't. But
I will say that from what I've read, while I am skeptical of the overall, I'm skeptical of efficacy just because I think that pharmaceutical industries lie all the time.
Well,
right? They have a habit of doing that. So I don't trust them as far as I can throw them, and they live in big, heavy buildings, so I can't throw them very far. That being said, it does squick me out a little bit, but at the same time, the promise of the technology is very impressive. And if it wasn't for the fact that a whole bunch of people who are all, hey, the world is overpopulated and we got to do something about this. Here, take our vaccine. Was not how the folks were running it in 2019, then going into 2020 and trying to save the planet or save everyone on the planet. I would be a little bit less skeptical for sure. Also, if it wasn't being this thing where they were trying to make the argument that we should have second-class citizens, I also wouldn't be as skeptical as I am. But because of all of the other stuff associated with it, and because the pharmaceutical companies have a tendency to lie, I want to see data. That being said, even though it's borderline gene therapy, based on the way the technology works, it could be one of the most impressive revolutions in medicine that we've had in a very, very long time, allowing us to much more rapidly assess, compile, and solve pandemics before they even start. And so I would probably try to support either Pfizer or Moderna.
I mean, from a technological standpoint, I can agree with you. I personally would never take either one of them, but I do like the technology. And as a matter of fact, you know what, there is another article I was thinking about throwing in here. I mean, we might as well, because this is literally the perfect segue. But personalized cancer vaccines using these mRNA technologies.
Right. And this is very impressive, right? Training your immune system to fight things before it ever actually sees the thing, and not having to do when you start talking about vaccines, one of the reasons why vaccines take a long time to produce is because they try to cultivate the actual virus, and that's expensive and time consuming. So these vaccines could end up being cheaper, faster, more efficient, and all done in a much more timely manner. But again, I want to see safety and efficacy data before I take something. And that's just me.
Well, but what's happening right now with this technology? It's gone on out in Mount Sinai. I mean, these tests have actually occurred.
Yep.
Oh crap! Oh, that's funny. My all caps thing comes up with Biden ATF shipment. Yeah, false claims about a shotgun. Oh yeah. Look into David Shipman. He's got a lovely storied past. I would recommend having a drink handy and or a smoke, because it's entirely possible that you'll be quite furious by the end of your read. But anywho, about the other point here, a personalized cancer vaccine that's being used now is using these technologies, and what they're doing, it's not as you say, to actually pre-treat these people, but to go into these folks that have had these cancers. What they're doing is they're taking a sample of the cancer and kind of making the body learn that this is the thing to attack with the immune system. I guess. And it's working. It's working really, really well. And some of the worst effects in people have been basically nothing happened. They're no worse for the wear other than they were a little sick for a few days. And the best results out of these trials so far, and these are phase 1 trials. These aren't even, long days in. But what's happening with these people is maybe they'll get a tumor excised. Excised? Is that the right word?
Yep.
Okay.
Well, yes, if you're talking about removing it.
Yeah. But they'll get a tumor excised, and then that'll be analyzed. They will make these custom instructions for you, inject you with the instructions in the form of these mRNA vaccines, so that your body knows what it fights against, that it makes these things, it kills them, and then it has, to put it in simple terms, the blueprint of the thing that it needs to now fight. And what it will do is, with the microscopic amounts of tumorous material or cancerous material that has the same, shall we say, genetic profile of this tumor that's been removed, it knows that that's the thing it has to destroy, so it cleans up the remainder, and then it doesn't have a chance to migrate or mutate, even. So, I mean, this is today, actually. Well, this isn't today. I believe this was, well, shit, actually, this came out 3 days ago. So this is actually brand new information. So, yeah, these things, I think we talked about this last week or maybe the week before as a potential application, and we're actually seeing it immediately. We're seeing studies coming out, which is pretty damn good. These studies have been over an 880-day mean follow-up time, so it's not bad. The vaccine, it says, was well tolerated. Roughly one-third of patients developing a major injection site reaction. That's not bad. That's kind of like what we're seeing with the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines. You know, the large majority is people are generally okay. Now, we don't know if this is going to do weird shit to people down the line. We don't know anything about this crazy quantum dot bullshit we heard something about that nobody's talking about anymore. Which I really hope that was just bullshit. But either way.
I mean, I don't know.
It's Bill Gates is involved, so, you know, you kind of can't roll it out being extra fucky, because, I mean, he's near it.
Can we at least appreciate the forward thinking of the X-Files when they did this kind of crap?
Absolutely. And then it came back and just wasn't the same. I saw a little
No,
bit.
I mean, so they turned around. If you like the X-Files, like the last couple seasons were weird. It was literally like somebody was on a straight drug trip, and then they tried to resurrect it, and they're like, oh, I know. Instead of going back to the first few seasons that were amazing, we're just going to basically go back to like nonstop drug-induced seasons. That sounds like a really good idea.
Like hunting gargoyles and that sort of thing. Maybe leave that to the warehouse, you know?
Yeah.
Which, by the way, excellent sci-fi show. Check it out. It's
Warehouse 13?
Yes. Warehouse 13. It's good TV.
So,
and there's actually a little bit of science in some of those episodes.
There is. And if you like that, you will probably also like The Librarians. That is very, very similar.
And, of course, I'm not familiar with that one, but I try and reference TV from a slightly less, shall we say, paused era.
No, I mean, The Librarians is fairly old, actually.
Oh, excellent.
I don't think they're diving into it. I mean, how old is The Librarians? But it's basically, it was, what is it? It's The Librarian. It's kind of like a little bit more.
Oh, I think I heard about that. The Librarian?
The Librarians was 2013 to 2018. I think it was also they also had a couple of movies prior to that.
Yeah, that's a little bit past my era. I was getting out of television by then.
2013 to 2018, it is basically, it's almost identical to Warehouse 13.
Oh, okay. Fair enough.
Yeah, they have very similar, like, it plays very similar to Warehouse 13. Like, it's its own unique thing, but it's not its own unique thing.
The Librarians and the Crown of King Arthur. Okay, well, fair enough.
Yeah. And it's based off of a series of movies that were, like TNT movies, and it was basically like that in a movie.
Oh, fair enough. Well, it ran up to 2018, so it's not a bad run.
No.
Speaking of all the things in all the world to break records, It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia is now the longest-running sitcom on television in the world.
Oh, my God, that's still running?
Yeah, actually.
Wow.
Yeah. It's
wow.
We've watched our little Philadelphia kids grow into something they probably never expected. To put it lightly. Well, that reminds me of something funny I saw on January 6th of this year. The kids attempt to fortify election. Oh, no, sorry, the gang. The gang goes to Washington.
Mm.
Yeah. Well, that's a slightly inside baseball joke for anybody that follows at least both of those topics. But hey, it's a little funny. And a little funny is pretty good in a world that's pretty dark and half on fire. So, everybody, thanks for tuning in. Give me a follow at that fake guy Dan. You can look up Steve. I can't guarantee you'll get a reply or a follow back or anything, but he's at Ratman720. If you got anything for him, feel free to hit me up. I'll be happy to convey the message. And if you got any ideas, topics, or anything else, let me know. There might be a website soon, but there is a very real possibility of streams soon, and also a real possibility that the show could go for a live recording. So we'll see how that goes. As I would love to take some live questions. That would be freaking dope. So anyway.
Ooh, that could be fun.
It could. It could be horrible, too. But
it could be very horrible.
But, I mean, it's going to be good horrible because it's a live stream. So, why not, right?
Yeah, we haven't done anything like that. That would be fun. That could be a lot.
Absolutely.
All 20 people who care to tune in.
Hey, people like the live streams on this sort of stuff. There's something about that talk radio energy that people really get into. And I don't know why. I enjoy some talk radio. It's better than half of the fucking terrible music that comes out. Speaking of, for some reason there are people that are listening to this that don't know I'm a DJ. Tuesday nights, aerithradio.co.uk. Tuesday 3 to 10 Eastern Standard, comes on midnight GMT, 4 p.m. Pacific. And I'm playing synthwave and some brand new cutting edge music. That's all good. I mean, I'm playing it, so of course it's good. But, I might be biased, but I'm not, because it actually is good. So anyway, it's been a pleasure, everybody. We'll talk to you again soon, and try and get in touch if you got anything for us. We'd love to hear from you. See you soon.